So I think that this, working from home is giving people an opportunity to rethink what their job entails and really focus on the results that can happen and not on something like time, which, while useful, is not really the ultimate measure of productivity.
You're listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with your host, Michael Palmer. Listen each week as inspiring guests share their secrets of success to help you increase your confidence, work smarter, and build a business you love. This episode of The Successful Bookkeeper is brought to you by PureBookkeeping.com, the proven system to grow your bookkeeping business.
Welcome back to the Successful Bookkeeper Podcast. I am your host, Michael Palmer, and today's show is going to be a great one. Our returning guest is a time management and productivity expert who has written books about those topics, including her newest one called The New Corner Office: How the Most Successful People Work from Home. Laura Vanderkam, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Laura, it's great to have you, and I can't think of a better time to talk about your new book because of what's going on in the world. But before we get into all of that, perhaps share a little bit about yourself for the listener who hasn't heard you on our podcast before, and a little bit about your life today in this new reality.
Yeah, so I write books on time management and productivity. I also have a few podcasts that are related to that topic, Before Breakfast, and this new one, The New Corner Office, which is also the name of this ebook that came out this summer about how the most successful people work from home. I live outside Philadelphia with my husband and my 5 kids. So the past 6 months or so have featured a lot of us under one roof all the time. But I'm happy to report that over the past month or so, the ranks of us being in the house during the workday have started to thin out considerably as the children slowly go back to school. It's really been quite something. The level of volume has dropped quite a bit, which is making working much more possible than it has been in any point since March. So I feel like things are slowly returning to normal.
It's incredible what we've all gone through, and so many have been disrupted around the world. Many tragic stories, and as well some silver linings in all of this as well, I think, as human beings, and being able to actually focus more on our families and be home. But certainly, hearing who you are with your family and what's gone on, I mean, who better to write a book on all of that? And I understand you started writing the book after the pandemic came into play, which again, you put out the book so quickly. I mean, you get things done, even though what was going on in the world. And I think that's why so many of our listeners love listening to you in the past episodes, because you're a person who can get things done, make things happen, and manage yourself and your time in a powerful way. So what has changed since the pandemic around productivity?
Well, a lot of people are having to rethink what makes a good day. In the past, if you were commuting to an office, you had a really good sense of what constituted an honest day's labor. I mean, you got up in the morning, you went to your office, you were there for a certain amount of time, at which point it was acceptable to leave, like you weren't going to sleep there. And if you went and sort of you were there, you'd done a good day, right? Whereas when you're home, everything has to be much more task-based. It's not about, have I been at work for 8 hours? It's like, well, what have I actually done with my time while I was working? And that can be a little bit disorienting if you have not really experienced it before. The first time you're like, wait, how do I know if the day is over? Like, when is it acceptable for the day to be over if I don't see people walking out the door? How do people know I'm working? How do I know if I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing? It's very disorienting, but it's also a great opportunity because ultimately, while I love time and time is a fabulous concept, it is not actually the best way to manage most sorts of work. Like, who cares if you're sitting in a chair for 8 hours? What matters is what you got done. And so I think that this, working from home is giving people an opportunity to rethink what their job entails and really focus on the results that can happen and not on something like time, which, while useful, is not really the ultimate measure of productivity.
So true. And I think it's having worked from home now for over a decade, it wasn't always easy for me to do and adjust. And just like you've said, the way I think about what work is and what is productivity, what am I producing in a day? It took me a long time to adjust to that, and people don't have the time to adjust to it. So what have you found from your community and your listeners? How have people, what have they faced or come up against in this adjustment?
Well, one of the biggest issues is figuring out how the day ends. Most people who are productive adults are going to start work at some point. There was this idea that, if people are working from home, they'll just be watching Netflix all day. That just almost never happens. You're going to sign in and start doing your work at some point. A more interesting question is, when does the day end? And for a lot of people, when there isn't that clear demarcation of I get in my car and I go home, it can be very nebulous. And so what you see happening is people sort of half working and half surfing the web into the evening, getting nothing of consequence done, but not really relaxing either. And so that's kind of the worst of all possible setups. So I've spent a lot of time over the past few months encouraging people to come up with a way to tell themselves that the day is over. It can be some sort of end of day ritual, whether it's calling a colleague to say goodbye, writing your to-do list for tomorrow, going to walk your dog, something like that. It can also be that you have crossed everything off the list of tasks that you set yourself for the day. I find that that's actually a very good way to indicate that the day is done. You have marched the distance that you set out for yourself, and so now you can rest to march again tomorrow. But, come up with something, or even, a commitment in your personal life. If you are tutoring kids online at 6:30 in the evening, well, you need to be done before then, and it will probably make you more efficient so that you can get to your next commitment as well. So come up with something that will allow you to end the day, so that even if you do see your workspace while you are not during work hours, you know that it's okay. You are allowed to relax.
So true. And I find it's that ending of the day can be very difficult, and it can lead to burnout, I would think.
Oh, definitely. And you've seen this with some research that has come out. A number of people say they've been working more nights and weekends than they have in the past. And on some level, it's well, why? I mean, if you lose the commute, you've got more hours during the day that you could work. I mean, right? If you were, leaving the house at 8 and getting to the office at 9, well, theoretically, you could, have an extra hour to work or something in the morning and not have lost any personal time and not need to work nights and weekends. But I think it's that lack of boundaries that people sort of feel like work is always an option. And that makes it harder for people to do other things and can definitely lead to burnout if you're not careful.
So ending the day strong, and that's definitely a big challenge. Have you seen other challenges out there as a result of where people are literally forced to stay home?
Well, one of the biggest ones, of course, for many people has been that childcare arrangements may have also fallen through at the same time that people were starting to work from home. And I think this is giving people something of a faulty impression about what working from home can be. It's not an inherently distracted by kids model. In the past, when people asked for my advice on working from home, I would always mention that it wasn't a good way to save money on childcare. You cannot be the adult in charge of your young children during the hours that you intend to work. But of course, when the pandemic happened and a lot of daycares closed, schools closed, people were suddenly in a situation where they didn't have other options. And so, people are like, I get so distracted working from home. It's well, you wouldn't, except that your kids are there with you too. In more of the normal world, that that would not be the case. But if you are operating in that situation, well, you need to, it still remains true that you can't really be the adult in charge. So you need to figure out some other way that you can make this work, whether it's swapping hours with your partner, if maybe you have another relative you can share care with, or a neighbor that you're comfortable sort of co-quarantining with, or if it's hiring a caregiver for a few hours a week, but something that allows you to have some quantity of time where you know you will be able to focus, because you can get honestly more done in 2 hours of focused work than you will in 4 hours of going back and forth between work and dealing with children's needs. It is very hard to make that work. And I know that's why a lot of people are feeling very frustrated. So doing what you can to get some amount of time of focused work is going to be life-changing.
Yeah, you've mentioned, I think, on podcasts when you've been on in the past around this whole concept of how you use the time, and I think it was Parkinson's law, the work allotted takes up the time allotted takes up the work that has to be done. So if you set 2 hours to get something done versus 4 hours to get something done, you're going to be more productive in the 2 hour.
Well, if you know that's the time you have, yes. I mean, work can expand to fill the available space. I would say that one of the issues right now is that many people simply aren't giving themselves enough focus space to get the amount of work that they have to do done. And that's why they are, of course, feeling overwhelmed and pulled in all sorts of directions. So like I said, I know it's challenging, but as kids go back to school, that's great. As daycares open up, that's great. If that's not an option in your area, you need to figure something else out of having maybe a formal swap schedule with your partner, or hiring a caregiver or something. But long term, it just doesn't work. It's not that there's anything wrong with you. It's that it doesn't work to care for young children and work simultaneously.
That's a good point, and that's likely where I've found myself going, and that's like, what is it about me that I'm not able to deal with, the distraction from my children while I'm working? I mean, even just a little bit of a distraction, they're relentless about getting my attention, and so that can lead to many ill feelings, right? It's like, I'm not getting enough done. This is distracting. So it's like, I'm actually setting myself up to fail before I've even begun.
Yeah. And it might take a little bit of creativity, but if you are, ending with the goal of you having focused hours to work, then you need to work backward from that to see, well, what solution is available that I'm comfortable with that lets me get there, and ask that question and go for it.
Beautiful. So you have, as you mentioned, 5 kids yourself. How has that been going for you?
Well, it's been going a lot better the past few weeks. Mm-hmm. It's little ones are starting to be out of the house. In particular, I think the most challenging one was my 5-year-old, because he needed adult supervision, whereas the older ones did not. But there just wasn't, the availability to interact with him constantly. He's a very high energy kid. He wound up watching a lot of YouTube videos over the summer. Like, you just put him in front of the computer and you let him do what he wants to do. And, on some level, it's like you feel like a horrible parent, but that's what it kind of took. So I hope that one summer of Camp YouTube, as I call it, will not ruin him for life. I like to think. I'm pretty sure it won't. But, we've all done what we needed to do to stay afloat. Even with Camp YouTube, there were sort of limited hours that were available for focused work. But, we're getting back to it. He's now in full day school that's meeting in person. And so fingers crossed that stays available.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the thought as you were speaking is this is like any challenge in life. We have to figure out a solution to the challenge. And there's always creative ways about going through something like this, like yourself with YouTube and remarkably, there's I come from a generation where it wasn't YouTube, it was called Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers, and we learned a ton from that. So I don't think we're broken, and there's actually probably remarkable programming. I would think I've already seen with my 5-year-old some of the stuff he will learn watching YouTube. So there is also silver linings inside of any solution that we come up with, but it does beg even in your saying, gee, I hope it doesn't ruin him. Well, some people may have guilt or shame about having to use that as a solution, which is not productive at the bottom line. And it's what you have to do to figure out how to deal with your life in these uncertain times.
Exactly. You do what you have to do. And sort of keep asking yourself the question, well, what would make daily life doable? We know that hopefully things are getting better wherever your listeners happen to be listening to this. But it's also not going to all go away tomorrow. So we have to figure out a solution that we can live with for at least, the next few weeks, next few months, and make sure that daily life doesn't feel like a total slog.
Absolutely. And let's hope it goes back quickly and like we all would. You, in your book, The New Corner Office, we talked a little bit already about some of the things the most successful people can do working from home. What are some of the other nuggets inside the book?
Well, I talk about this idea of managing by task rather than time. So that's certainly something we talk about. We talk about getting the rhythm of the day right. One really important thing if you work from home is coming up with a kind of cadence for the day that takes into account your energy levels. You do have the ability to shape your day based on how you work best. And so it's kind of a missed opportunity not to take advantage of this. So figuring out, when is my most energetic time and how can I match my most important work to the time when I'm best able to deal with it? How can I take an appropriate number of rejuvenating breaks? The, sneaky little truth here is that people take breaks anyway, whether they think they are or not. It's just that the breaks often look like, clicking on a link to Facebook and then suddenly losing 30 minutes looking at photos of people you really didn't like from high school. And, that is one way to spend your break. It's probably not that energizing, whereas getting off your phone or your laptop and going outside for a 15-minute walk would in fact be rejuvenating. You'd come back with a lot more energy, and it would be quicker as well than falling down these social media rabbit holes. So planning in breaks for when your energy dips, making sure you're doing good things during that time. Of course, we talked about ending the day well. And also I want to put a shout out here for thinking about your team, your network, both your colleagues that you may be working with sort of more regularly as you're working from home, but also how you might grow and expand your network while working from home. And this is certainly more challenging, when you're sitting at a desk as opposed to being out and about in the world. But it is definitely doable with a little bit of discipline about reaching out to people, to scheduling chats, and things like that.
So true. And I would think that's likely an area that many would have to be aware of is the lack of social interaction. That's not just going to happen on its own. It's something that has to be thought about and executed on. Any strategies in the book around doing that?
Well, for your colleagues, it's relatively straightforward. I mean, you can start meetings with social chit-chat time. It's human nature to do it anyway. And we start all Zoom meetings with, how's the weather? What are you up to? Mm-hmm. Right. But you can have it be a little bit more facilitated for more authentic sharing. I guess if people are actually talking about a topic that's a bit facilitated and having it part of the agenda for any given meeting, you can pick up the phone and call people. It's sort of those casual, unscripted, unscheduled interactions that people feel they are missing out on when they are not in an office. But we have these phones in our hands, 99% of the day. It turns out you're allowed to use those to call people. You do not need a formal scheduled time to call someone, especially somebody that you have been working with for years. I mean, that's kind of silly. So, if you want to talk to someone, pick up the phone and call. Just have one of those 5-minute chats. If you would have chatted with somebody on, after a meeting on the way to the bathroom, we'll call them after a meeting and make whatever point you would have made about the funny thing that happened in the meeting. Just check in with people, see how they're doing. You could have virtual coffees with people, like you're taking a break mid-morning, call a work friend and chat with them during that time. You can also have more formalized social interactions with your colleagues. That whole Zoom happy hour thing was one of the unfortunate beginning pandemic aspects. I mean, when something happens and, we all had to go virtual overnight, people were trying to replicate what would have happened in the office using technology that was available. And it makes sense. But long term, we realized that some things just don't replicate well. Any social event, it's better off to have something that's facilitated, like a book club discussion, for instance, than a happy hour, because you just can't have that sort of one-on-one turning to different group casual interactions when you've got a big group of people on Zoom. But one thing I would also say is that when you work in an office, you spend a lot of time with your colleagues, but possibly past the point of diminishing returns. I mean, you go out to lunch with your colleagues, you have coffee with your colleagues, and you start to feel like your need for a professional network is satisfied by your colleagues. But of course, that isn't really true. Like, there are people outside your immediate office who are good to know professionally, good to know personally. And when you are working from home, you escape those group time norms that make you feel like you have to explain yourself if you're leaving at 3:30 to go have coffee with someone who's not your colleague. You don't have to do that. You just go and do it. And if you take advantage of that opportunity, you can build a far more robust network. Now, do most people do that? Probably not. When you're sitting in your home office, it's easy just to sit there, or, even when social distancing or lockdowns are in effect, I mean, it's easy not to call people. But making a point of doing so allows you to reach out to people outside your immediate colleagues. And there are great advantages to doing so.
So true. And I think it has been interesting how people have figured out Zoom. It's like initially it's new, it's different. There's all sorts of things that people are concerned about: the way they look, the way their background looks, the way they interact, how they interact. But we're figuring it out slowly but surely, which, it's certainly having a social time at the office where you're all meeting people and having conversations, that sort of thing, is fantastic. It's hard to replace that, but we're also learning on how to do that and how to get satisfaction and benefit out of being online, which has been pretty cool as well. What have been some of the real surprising things for you out of the pandemic?
Well, what's interesting to me is how many people thought that certain things had to be done in person, which, when it is not possible to do them in person, you learn that, there are other approaches. I mean, I think about all the people in client service who are like, well, you can't pitch $1 million project by video call. You have to be there in person. Well, turns out if you're not allowed to be there in person, you can, in fact, pitch the work by video conference. And I read a funny thing that, like, law firms, for instance, are incredibly profitable right now, at least, the better run ones of them, because their travel costs have fallen by so much that in the past, their partners would have been on the road like 3 days a week visiting clients, and now they don't have to do that. They're, working from their home offices like anyone else, and suddenly you're not paying, $10,000 for a business class ticket to London. And guess what? You don't do that, your bottom line is going to look better. So it's fascinating to see how that has played out.
Very interesting. And I would say to all our listeners, you should be expecting lower rates from your lawyers.
Well, that's the funny thing, though. I mean, the professional service firms haven't really lowered the rates because, people are still not looking for that at the moment. And
Right.
So when their costs are lower, you're just like, wow, it's interesting what that does.
I just want to take a swing at the lawyers out there, but the bad ones anyways. So it is remarkable. So that's been really surprising. The amazing what we can accomplish when we're faced with having to accomplish that task, right? We don't have a choice, so we're figuring it out. And inside of your community, you mentioned you have a large community. You do a couple of podcasts. Have you seen anything along those or examples of people that have done something new or come up with something innovative in their lives?
Well, I think a lot of people have had to pivot how they are doing their jobs. And, I've seen this in my own life with a big chunk of my business in 2018, 2019 was speaking at conferences. And of course, in March, everything for the next 2 months, 3 months canceled very quickly. But then we started to see in the summer, well, you still can't schedule a conference. Like people don't want to go, even if it's in a place where it might be, legal with various guidelines. Nobody wants to sit in a crowded conference hall with 3,000 of their closest friends from all over the world. Like that's just not something people are going to be comfortable with for a long, long time. So that said, people haven't quite figured out what virtual programming looks like that is, most helpful to people, that people are willing to, invest in. And so that's something, I'm certainly trying to figure out in my own life. And I've seen a lot of the places that I have done events for in the past struggling to figure that out as well, how they can keep people's attention and get them to invest their time and attention in a virtual event. Just even little things like the podcasting world, people are spending less time in the car. So they're having to come up with, you need to catch people's attention if you are a podcaster, but people are thinking about, well, what other points of my life can I put a podcast in? Like, what are the things I do that could involve listening to a podcast? There's just so many things that we are having to rethink. And some of that is, unfortunate, obviously. No one would wish this pandemic on anyone. But there's also just some interesting opportunities. I certainly think a lot of organizations will not go back to 5 days a week in the office, because I think anyone who wants to work from home 2 days a week, like there's just not that mounting an obstacle. You don't have to fight a battle to show that you can still do your job while doing it. Like people have been doing their jobs working from home 5 days a week. Now that doesn't mean that everything can be done best working from home, but certainly there is an opportunity to just set that dividing point a little bit differently and reach some sort of hybrid model, maybe 2 to 3 days at home, 2 to 3 days in the office, do the social stuff when you're in the office, do the focused individual work when you're at home, and hopefully get the best of both worlds.
Very true. And I would say in our listeners would likely relate to often there would be companies that would want on-site services and, have to have those services. And that's the only way we want to do the services with on-site. And now it's like you can't go on-site. So we're going to deliver it virtually. And there's certainly some learning moments, dissatisfaction, trying to figure out the way to go and make it as effective as being on site. But once those are learned, it actually is a better, more efficient, more effective way of doing it. And so it's been, I think, a real positive shift for our community in that the people that were sort of the laggards in embracing virtual business have had to embrace that, which has been good. Another point of, look, when we're faced with having to solve things, it's amazing what we can come up with. And I see it in our own work. Like we're a virtual company, if you will. We don't have to be anywhere. We do everything that we do is pretty much online. However, we still meet and we have, staff that come into the office and we have those interactions. And so it was like thinking that would be a challenge or different. It's actually gotten better. And so I think that's a mix that will be in the future. Let's take all of the good stuff from both scenarios and mix them all together and just have a really productive environment, whether a bit of that's at an office or a bit of that's at home. We can make it all work. And so we're having to embrace new things and figure it out. And when you give yourself the time and bandwidth to do it, it's amazing what you figure out.
Exactly.
Laura, now you wrote this book very efficiently. You got it done. You're a very productive person. What kind of productivity tips for those that may have not listened to some of the past work? They're working from home. We've talked a lot about that. But in terms of just productivity, pure productivity that you find to be some of the keystone bits of advice that you would give for people to get more done in the day, what would those be?
Well, one of my favorite bits of advice is to plan your weeks on Fridays. Everybody needs one, regular weekly planning time where you review what's going on in your life, review what you need to do in the upcoming week, think about what you'd like to do in the upcoming week, and schedule those things in. I like Friday afternoons just because it's a time when most people aren't doing much else. You're kind of sliding into the weekend at that point. But if you take a few minutes on Friday afternoon to think about the upcoming week, make yourself a 3-category priority list, top priorities for your career, for your relationships, and for yourself. Just a couple items in each category. See where you can put those in. You will find yourself making a lot more progress toward your long-term goals.
Great tip. A little bit of planning can do great. And what is it about Friday that you think makes that a good day to do it?
Well, just, you're unlike, say, Monday morning where you're ready to hit the ground running. Most people are kind of dragging by Friday afternoon. It's hard to start any new kind of work, but you might be willing to think about what future you should be doing. So you can turn what might be wasted time into some of your most productive minutes of the week. The good news about it being during the work week is if you need to set up appointments or set up meetings, the people you need to set those up with are probably still at their desks, so you'll get a response. Whereas if you plan on, say, Sunday night, that might not be the case. The other reason I like it is it gives you a chance to think about your weekend if you haven't thought about your weekend yet. So you have a few minutes to think about that and maybe make some plans and have some fun. And it also gets rid of, those Sunday scaries that a lot of people suffer from. And I think, if you don't like your job, that's one thing. But even people who do like their jobs often feel a bit of trepidation on Sunday afternoon into Sunday evening. And I think it stems from knowing that there's this big pile of work waiting for you, but being unsure how you're going to tackle it. And so your brain is circling around trying to think about, what do I have going on? What's all the stuff that's going on? Oh, I have so much. I don't know what I'm doing. Well, if you make a plan on Friday for the next week, you know exactly what you're going to do Monday morning. You know exactly what's waiting for you. You know when there's a time throughout the week for all those things you need to get to. And so then your brain can relax and you don't have to worry about it quite so much until you're ready to start work again.
Fantastic tip, and makes so much sense. Cap off that week and come into Monday strong and ready to go. Laura, this has been fantastic as always. Thank you for coming and sharing with our listener ways that they can be productive and get more done out of their day and have a more satisfying life. It makes a difference. And so on behalf of our listener, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And of course, you can find out more about Laura at lauravanderkam.com. That's LauraVanderkam.com. Get some of Laura's books, follow her podcasts. She's got gold that can help you live a better life, a more productive life. And so with that, we wrap another episode of the Successful Bookkeeper Podcast. To learn more about today's wonderful guest and to get access to all sorts of valuable free business building resources, you can go to thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with Michael Palmer. For more information and to download the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit us at thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Thank you for listening.